while organizations such as the FARC were not initially directly involved in the production and exportation of cocaine, they did allow such activities to be carried out in the territories they controlled in Colombia, and they also taxed the producers, an income which became vital for their ability to maintain their civil war against the government by buying arms and other supplies. Much later, the FARC and other groups would even begin to engage in production themselves. Thus, the production of cocaine in Colombia during the period of Pablo's ascendancy and at its height cannot be separated from the political circumstances of the country during the second half of the 20th century. This was the world into which Pablo Escobar was emerging in the late 1960s. By the time he was in his later teens, the man who would subsequently proclaim that he was simply, quote, a decent man who exports flowers, was already involved in organized crime, albeit on a low level in Medellín. Working in association with Oscar Benel Aguirre, he was selling contraband cigarettes and engaging in grand theft auto. The pair and their associates also conducted a number of high-profile kidnappings and collected large sums of money as ransoms. And Escobar was more ambitious still. He wanted to become rich and to do so quickly. And so, to that end, he was willing to engage in all manner of crime to acquire money. By the early 1970s, this included smuggling marijuana, and it was only a change of cargo from there to cocaine later on. As a result, many viewed him as a man marked. When Pablo met and began courting Maria Victoria Henao, who was a teenager around this time, her mother is said to have warned her that she should forget about him unless she was willing to spend much of her life visiting him in prison. Maria was undeterred, and eventually they married in 1976, when he was 26 and she was just 15. They would have 2 children, Juan and Manuela. It was in the mid-1970s, shortly before his marriage to Maria, that Pablo first became involved in the growing cocaine trade when he was brought into the business by another smuggler named Griselda Blanco. Cocaine had been something of a niche drug in the United States in the 1960s, with other narcotics such as marijuana, LSD, and heroin proliferating to a much greater extent. However, in the 1970s, the use of cocaine exploded across the country, particularly as the disco scene in cities such as New York and Miami expanded. As a result, the market for cocaine in Latin America, and in particular in Colombia, expanded exponentially. This was the situation which allowed drug cartels and small operators, such as Pablo was to begin with, to get into the business in the first place in Colombia in the mid-1970s. His first engagement was with some established smugglers in Medellín, who hired Pablo to deliver consignments of coca paste to processing facilities around Medellín and the wider area, so it could be fully processed into powdered cocaine. Before long, Pablo was cutting out some of the intermediaries and developing his own operations to fly large consignments of fully processed cocaine out of Colombia and into the United States using various routes. And little did they know at the time that Pablo and his associates had fashioned the beginnings of what became known as the Medellín Cartel. The Medellín Cartel was almost over before it ever really got going. In May 1976, Pablo and several others were arrested on their way to Medellín with a large consignment of 18 kilograms of coca paste. Pablo's first instinct was to try to bribe those who had arrested him, and subsequently the judges themselves in Medellín. This did not work, so Pablo then tried to have the arresting officers murdered to stop them from testifying at his trial. Evidently, the possible risks which were now associated with trying to pursue Escobar were such that the authorities ultimately decided to drop the case. He walked free, but the manner in which he had made the charges disappear was symptomatic of Pablo's approach for the next 15 years or so. Escobar was always willing to use violence if it could win him an edge over his competitors or keep the authorities from catching up with him. And this is important to remember in any assessment of Pablo Escobar. He would continuously, in the years to come, try to depict himself as a humble trader of drugs, which he believed would someday be legalized anyway. But behind such self-serving depictions was someone who ordered thousands of deaths over the years. Escobar and the Medellín Cartel's business exploded in the late 1970s, not just owing to the expansion of the market for cocaine in the United States, but because the cartel developed a number of highly effective methods for importing the drug into America. Shortly after they had been released from prison in Connecticut in 1976, two mid-level drug smugglers by the names of Carlos Leda, a German Colombian, and George Young, an American from Massachusetts, had come into the employ of Escobar. Leda had ended up in Danbury Prison in Connecticut for smuggling marijuana and selling stolen cars, while Young had been running an operation to bring marijuana to California from Mexico, and then shipping it across the country to New England, where it fetched an enormous price compared to what it had been bought for at source. However, at Danbury, they conceived of a plan to move into the now growing cocaine trade. Consequently, when they were released, they began smuggling cocaine from Colombia through the Caribbean and onwards into America, principally through Florida and the city of Miami in particular. Initially, Escobar hired the pair to begin facilitating the expansion of his business by bringing in ever greater consignments of cocaine to the United States. But this would soon expand. In 1978, Carlos Leda began buying up property on the Bahamian island called Norman's Cay, with the intention of converting it effectively into a cocaine depot between Colombia and America. In the months that followed, he intimidated local landowners into selling their properties, including murdering some of the residents. Leda, a paranoid and volatile figure, also largely pushed Young out of the operation at this time. Thus, within a few months, he had virtually converted the island into a personal fiefdom, and then he invested millions of dollars to build a runway and warehouses. For the next several years, Norman's Cay acted as the Medellín Cartel's personal airport in the Caribbean, off the coast of the United States and in close proximity to the world's largest cocaine market.